Recording in progress.
Okay, we're still up to the thing with the shoes. We've been working through the kavanas of putting on your shoes, which are, of course, also the kavanas of the bracha, shosli kol tzarki. We've discussed how shosli kol tzarki has 2 or 3 different meanings. We can understand it as meaning have everything up to the shoes, so have everything. It's the abundance of having everything, even shoes, which are maybe sort of a luxury if it's not the most important thing. That's one way of reading it. A second way of reading it would be the opposite way, which are have everything is a way of talking about shoes, just like al tzarki, as we've quoted Ma'am Chazal that said, a person should sell everything he has and buy shoes. In other words, reading that shoes is very important. You can't really go out of your house if you don't have shoes, or you're gonna hurt yourself. So it seems to be very important to have shoes, and we've discussed how that's mostly so you don't hurt yourself, which got us into a whole discussion about how everything needs protection, and we call this chashmal, which is protection of imeilah that protects the zone, and so on. There's something similar to that which happens to us when we enter the zone, something like a sukkah, which is imeilah protecting the zone. Very lot of different images for this kind of thing. So that was the second pshat in Shosli Kol Tzarki. Now we're up to a third pshat, which we've also discussed, a third reading in the pshat of Shosli Kol Tzarki, which it's really not only about the shoes. That since shoes are what you wear when you're standing at the door, you're going out. That's why it's like the last bracha and that seder, where you're getting dressed and then you're going out. So that's when you do Shosli Kol Tzarki. In other words, there's a movement or an action of going out of your house. In your house, you're protected, but when you go out, you need to have shoes to be protected. But it's more than the protection that the shoes are giving you, but the preparation of Shosli Kol Tzarki. In other words, everything I'm going to do today, I'm going to work, I'm going to take care of what I need to do. It's going to be me'ake bracha, and God providing you all of that. Now, in the Kabbalah reading, as we've seen, there's all of these readings. We could talk about the moichen that have to do with the shoes, which is really this chashmal, so it's going to be connected, but we learned that he understands the chashmal to just be another instance, or the last level of imma, which goes into the is that chashmal, so it's related to that. Second one, we discussed at length how this is a protection, and why this is exactly the place that needs protection, because there's chitzonim after the lowest level, atzilus, which is the nuk, or the or pnimi of the nuk, they have the chitzonim, and therefore we need to create a barrier in between them. And we discussed a little bit of how this barrier might work.
Recording stopped.
The third thing that we've learned about Shosli Kol Tzarki is how it means the provision of everything by going out of your house and where you're going to work to provide to everything. And we've quoted the Ramak in Tefillah Moshe, which is here, which explains this through the language of Shosli Kol Tzarki, since we have this whole concept, which we never described, we're never taught to learn this concept in depth. Really, all of these things are just making me think that I need to go back and learn all of the basic structures, the basic Yisaidus of the Arizal. We're just doing Kavanas, but I do think that this is a direction to go in, since we have the heter and the power, the siyata d'shmaya of doing things in a way of halacha l'masa, in a practical way, which is really what everything is for. So there's a big difference between trying to understand things as an abstract philosophy and trying to understand them when they're still the abstract philosophy, or abstract, I don't think philosophy is the right word, abstract Kabbalah of how the Olamas work, but they are in the context of how am I going to be mechavan this when I put on my shoes. That changes the attitude to what we're doing. And that's why, although we're going slightly backwards, I'm thinking maybe to do some kind of series that will go in the more direct way, at least to have some basic concepts. but I feel like it's actually a better way to get into understanding, because the practice is what actually shows us the things, or actually shows us the truth of the ideas or the levels, the things that we're trying to get at. So the Ramak read Asli Kaltsarki related to the very basic idea that we learned from the Ramak. Mostly learned it from the Kenazar, and Pardes there's a shar called Shar Bria, where he discusses the sources from this and what it means, which is that there's 4 different levels of creation, 4 different kinds of creation, right? And the Kabbalim connected that to 4 different Shemot Nirdafim, right? There's different synonyms, synonyms that mean the same thing. So at least the 3 we'll talk about, bria, Yetzira, Asira, seem to mean the same thing, just different Hebrew words for creation. Bara means creation, Yatzar means creation, Asa means made, so can be made to mean creation. Of course, there's atzilus, which is not entirely that, so that's why it's somewhat different, but at least if we talk about these 3 words, the Kabbalah Man Ramak in that shar explains how the match, how the meaning gets to that. We'll get to that. We'll go through that better. But there's what this does is that every time we see a word like Shasa or Sheyatzar or Shebara, we start thinking of these different levels, like we discussed in the Bracha of Asher which has Asher Yotzar, Ubarabai, and then Maflilasla. So it seems to be mentioning these 3 worlds, Bria, Yetzira, Asiya. And of course, atzilus is the neshama itself, or as we discussed it over there. Now, in a similar fashion, he reads if we say she'asa li kal tzarki, so it doesn't say she'yotzar li kal tzarki, it doesn't say she'bara li kal tzarki, it's she'asa. So this must signify on the shefa and the oil getting to olam ha'asiya. And the way he explained it, and he connected it to the concept of shoes, is to explain what does it mean, why would this be olam ha'asiya, and how does this work. So 2 things. Number 1, these kal tzarki, what you need is an olam ha'asiya, and that's why it corresponds to the shoes, which is sort of the lowest level, the lowest thing that you have going down. So if we consider the shechina, we'll get to explain how this works. If we consider the shechina, the atzilus going down to give shefa to this world, that would be considered her shoes, and therefore when she goes to olam ha'asiya, that's when she gives your shoes, that's she'asa li kal tzarki. But there's another very important point that Ramak made there, which is that didn't start there. And he reads she'asa li pirish himshech ba'asiya li kol ha'nitzrach. Right? So in other words, nothing really starts in olam ha'asiya. Of course, when he says she'asa li kal tzarki, what we really mean is that he brought it down from olam ha'atzilus through bria Yetzira until olam ha'asiya. Now, once we get thinking of this, so this, now we're going to get back to the Arizal's language. This makes us think of what it actually means, or how this might work, this bringing down of olam, things from olam atzilus through olam bria, through olam yetzira, through olam ha'asiya, and how this actually works. So the Arizal again is referencing things that he already discussed when he discussed the elements, how they work, and we're going to try to at least a little bit reverse engineer it from here, or as much as it's relevant to us. And Arizal said like this: in other words, we've learned that Nal is the Chashmal, and really what he means to say here is that he's continuing off that. We're continuing off the idea of the Chashmal being Imma that surrounds the Zon, and he said it surrounds it from the side, which is called Levishim, and it surrounds it on the bottom, under them. Then it would be called shoes. So it's really the same idea, the same existence, the same thing, that just in its different attributes and its different parts would get different names. But here he really wants, I think, the way there's some controversy about this, but it seems like over here he wants to get into what aspect actually would be this Nal. So as it's distinct from just being a levush or just a protection, and what it does besides for being a protection. So again, we can talk about the protection, but now we have to talk about the third thing, and just like Atzaliki, where it's also being mishtalshel and going down through the olam atzilus until olam ha'asiya, and giving you something over there. So the Rizal says like this: Anal hazeh kini b'chinas hamesach shenizbar atzlene shemafsek ben olam atzilus ben olam bria. So now we have this very big question. And again, a more general question, which is how actually did worlds get separated? So we talk about 4 worlds, and the Ramak right away in the beginning of his Parashah Arabia and Pardes asks, so does that mean that there's really 40 spheres? We all learned that Esav Leitesha, there's only 10 spheres. How could there be 40 spheres? Or another way really of asking the question is what causes one. Well, we know there's different levels, so we could talk about them as different levels of causality. If one causes the other, that becomes another level. Or we could talk also of levels of revelation, right? In Chachma, for example, the Ein Sof is more open, it's more revealed, we can feel it, we can see it openly. So that's why it's considered Chachma, it's considered a higher level. Once you go down, it's considered lower level, there's less Ein Sof, and I'll explain this in the beginning of Etz Chaim, and the concept of Tzimtzum, and all of that. But so what's the difference, what kind of qualitative difference must there be between 2 different worlds? So if there's just one more level, let's say we talk about Olam atzilus, bring 10 spheres of atzilus, and then 10 spheres of Olam bria, which are the next 10 levels. That would be the simplistic way of reading it. It doesn't seem to be clear why we would make a cutoff after Olam atzilus. Why don't we just say, okay, so there's 20 spheres in Olam atzilus, or of course, just like every other sphere, they each go down. They're going down. This is levels on the ladder stepping down, so we could call it stepping down. But why is it called another world? What's the difference between these 2 worlds? Why are they 2 different worlds? Worlds sort of seem to signify some, we could call it like a jump, right? There's a difference. There's some bigger difference between the entirety of Olam Bria and the entirety of Olam Atzilus than there would be just between 2 levels. So if we say, okay, so it's a little further, so suddenly it got a new name, that doesn't seem to be enough for these people. And especially as the Ramak notices, that would basically tell us that there are 40 spheres, and it seems to be incorrect since we've learned that there's only 10 spheres. So now the Ramak had an answer, and we're going to get to what he really discussed over here. But first we have to answer the first question, which is really what causes these elements to be a different element. Maybe the Ramak says it, the Rizal is more clear about this. And the Rizal says, and he goes on about this at length in Etz Chaim and Sham and Bez. And the Rizal basically says that there's a difference between just becoming further and further from something. Like we say, Chachma is different than Bina, and Bina is different from Das, and Da and Za, and so on. And being entirely closed off and getting it through what he calls a mechitza, a masach. Masach like le masach pesach, like a pareches or a mechitza. And then Rizal explains that there's of course even the Olam atzilus gets things through a mechitza, through a masach. Like we talk about the Za getting things through Imma, so the Imma herself would be a masach, and we'll see here that maybe this masach is also Imma. So we're getting it through Imma, so it's also through a masach. But the way he says it is, Bracha, I'm recording a class, let me do it. And the Rizal asked this question, and he says in Etz Chaim, in Shalom and Beis, that there's differences, and this is his image at least, which is 2 different kind of differences. We could talk about a entirely closed masach, which means you're going to get everything. Well, sometimes we, after Chabad and the Maggid, call this getting something entirely in translation, right? So you can get the entire thought in some sense, but it's not the original body of thought at all, because it's translated, and translation can have different levels, of course. We could talk about just changing in different language, and if it could be accurate, the translation into a different language. But if you translate something into different concepts, even because people have different concepts and different languages also have different concepts, then you're really getting something else. It's hard to say that it's something else. It's sort of a translation of that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a translation either. But it's not it's not the light. You don't get the. They talk about in Chabad, they like talking about these differences very much. What it would mean exactly to get something through a translation or another. Really, the Rizal sort of talks about 2 different kind of things. One is a tzemtzum, one is a partzuf. In other words, the Olam atzilus, even the Zav Olam atzilus, especially which he's talking about over here, doesn't get light directly from Abba or from Ein Sof, right? Because Ein Sof goes to Chachma, and Chachma goes to Bina, and Bina goes into Za. And then from Bina, he said the Rizal always calls it a window. what we call the Yisod Ima, is a window from the Zan. We talk about, and windows, of course, windows in heaven are a biblical image. So there's a gate, a door, an opening into heaven, which is the Makam Migdash. And that's an image of as if everything is closed off, but we left you one little space, and that's also the image of Tzimtzum that Arizal generally has. We left you one little space, and through that, the light from the higher level gets to you. So you get a little bit of the same, we could call it, this is not a translation, but a sort of mi'ut. It's not that you're getting it only in translation. You could understand one word of the whole book, right? So if there's a whole book which explains Divrei Chachma, this is almost Chabad style mushal, then if you would understand only one chapter, and maybe that chapter is the most important one or the least important one, we could have differences of that, which part or which word, but at least you have one word of it, and you don't have the entirety of it, but you have part of it. Then we could just take the whole book and put it through a translation machine. Then you don't even get anything of it, you get just the entire, maybe even get more, but entirely translation. Now the different levels of these chaloines and masachim are really what defines the difference between different olamas and different spheres in olam atzilus even. As the Rizal explains this in great detail. And in any case, so therefore, as long as you're in olam atzilus, of course olam atzilus is itself some sort of masach, but let's not consider that. Now, what makes olam atzilus and olam bria distinct worlds as opposed to just different levels is that between the olam atzilus and olam bria, there is not any space, there's not any hole, there's not any window that you can see from olam atzilus through olam bria, at least not in a simple way. But what there is a masach, a pereches, a curtain, a real boundary between olam atzilus and olam hayetzira and olam bria, and everything olam atzilus, olam bria will be through that masach. It cannot get anything directly from olam atzilus, and that is really what makes olam bria into a totally different world, right? When we think of the concept of world, what we usually think of is what you can imagine existing, right? So we can have a lot of different levels, like in this world, or a world. When I say a world, I don't mean literally a world. Rizal does use very simple, literal images and talks about it as being 4 floors, 4 flights, which are like 4 olamas, but that's just for the clarity of the thing. But when I talk, I'm just trying to give a little more concept. When you try to talk about a world, what I really mean is, in your world, there could be, for example, if someone grows up in a certain society, so to him, there are, of course, every society has tzaddikim, benim, reshaim. There's no such a thing as society without different levels, without different hierarchies, without different levels of people, right? There's good people, there's bad people, there's sort of normal people in between. Okay, so that's your world. So in other words, that world has itself like 10 spheres, like different levels. You could be malchus of this world, you could be more clear about this world, you could be the highest level, you could be the kesser of this world. That's the top. But nobody in this world imagines something that's entirely different, right? So nobody, I don't want to say examples to get people mad. Nobody in the standard Western world, nobody imagines something that's really a tzaddik, right? As an example, there's good people, there might be even inspired people, there might be all kinds of different things, but you need to actually enter into a religious world to even imagine that in your world should even exist something called a real tzaddik, and whatever real tzaddik means. And for us, I don't know what world I'm in, but you could see, if you straddle these worlds, you could see that there's a real difference in what people even imagine to be possible for a human being. If you, in America, yes, there's better people and worse people, and there's even great people, and actually they even heard of like what we call saints or holy people, but they don't really conceptualize it the way it's conceptualized within a religious world, where there's different concepts and different levels. So yeah, maybe it's a good person, maybe someone that dedicates himself to doing good and so on. And if you go into the Chassidish world, for example, then you'll hear about a tzaddik as someone that literally, and this is, of course, maybe it's an exaggeration, maybe this is what Kant called a regulative ideal, maybe it's just something that we hope to get to, but at least it's something that exists in this world. So of course, maybe we're in the malchus of that world, and this is talking about Atik, okay, but at least there's something that exists. And we talk about, if you go into Chassidish stories and Chassidish books, you talk about it's a person that doesn't do any move without an intention, without a yichud, right? That doesn't, and there's literally the things that they say. Now, for this to even exist, it needs to be in a different world. So that's, and if I want to go into America and explain them this, I can't, it's not the pshat. If I go to a Chassidish person, this is a very good move. If I go to a Chassidish person, I tell them, you, maybe some days, maybe on Shabbos, maybe when you're in a good mood, maybe, then you could eat with kavanah. You could, for every bite you take, you could have some mechavan Hashem, right? That's kavanah zarizah. So that's your level. But if you imagine a tzaddik which does this all week, okay, so that he would be the attic of your world. And you're different. But if I go to America and I start talking about this, it's not, my problem is not that I can't get them to imagine someone that can do it 24 hours a day or 10 hours a day would be a lot, or 2 hours a day, right? Well, the problem is that I can't even explain to him what it would mean to eat a piece of pizza and be mechavan Hashem. He's like, what does that even mean? So I have to translate the whole thing into something else where it loses almost all of its meaning. It might, if I'm a good translator, I might be able to. There's people that work on this, that this is their job, to translate really holy things, really chassidus misogim, into the world of America. And I say, well, you could eat, I don't know, mindfully, right? That's the world. That's already a mitzvah. It's a psach hashmal. You could eat mindfully. And yes, that's a translation, but it totally doesn't mean what it means in the chassidus world. And then we could talk about levels. So you could see very easily that there's something called being in one world. I'm in the same world as, if you're in the chassidus world, you're in the same world as the chassidus tzaddikim. Of course, you're not in their level. And then that would be called receiving or through a light, through a little hole, through a little window. So you don't get the whole thing, of course, but you get some of it. You can get tuf, and he gets aleph. And then there's something called being in a totally different world, where everything is through a mechitza. Everything goes through a translation level, and you literally don't have access to any of the actual objects in that world. Okay, and this is one mushal. We think in a lot of different terms for this. Just want to give some sort of understanding, so we should be able to grasp onto this thing of being a mechitza and being a window. Now, back to where we are. Oh, that was fun. So I have to go back to the real part, the technical part. So now this is the Arizal's teaching. So there's a masach, mechitza. This is mafsek ben olam atzilus leolam ha bria. And of course, the same thing between bria and yetzira. There might be some difference, because of course yetzira has some even further. It's not only a quantity of being three more. There's actually a difference, which he talks about in Yitzchok over there. But this is the similar. And between a world, there needs to be a masach. So now the Arizal thinks through his image, and the Arizal thinks everything in the image of a person, right? The parts of. And he says, okay, if olam atzilus, and of course we'll get to in the next piece how exactly this means all parts of atzilus. But if olam atzilus in general can be considered one person, right? A adam. Then we're thinking of the bottom of it. We're thinking of what stops this person from existing and lets another person or another world start existing. And of course, the lowest thing, or the thing, it's not even the thing, right? The thing that's after the person, that's on the bottom of the person, the lowest thing place of the person, and is mafstik between him and the next world, or the ground, or the next thing, are his shoes. So Arizal says, when you think of a masach, I have a way of thinking of it, which is the shoe. So the shoe of olam atzilus is this masach, this paroiches, which is mafsik ben olam atzilus leolam bria. That's the shoe of olam atzilus. And really what he wants to say is that when you put on your shoes, which is just is what he's been saying the whole time, when you put on your shoes, really what you're doing is embodying, if you are the atzilus or whichever parts of atzilus you are, maybe we'll get to talk about these differences in a minute. If you're the atzilus, then your shoes are the mechitza, which is mafsek, which creates the boundary between olam atzilus and olam bria. Okay, so that's the first thing we know. Now, we need to, of course, go into this more. We need to understand two important things, which, again, these things are already in the Remak in some ways, but that is a lot more clear and deliberate about these things. Just that when I say there's a masach, so what I say is two things. Number one, I have to understand that masach is not only on the last level of olam atzilus. So we could say the nalem, right? The language of Shira Shira. How beautiful are your steps in your shoes, right? So that's talking about the Shechina. And there's of course beautiful shoes which sort of keep us from getting to what's beyond the shoes, right? We have to figure out how to go through that. And if you read that song, you see that it goes up. Then it talks about Chinik Yerechayich, and Rashi already says that we're trying to ascend. The shoes is just where we start. But for the Arizal, that's not enough, because he doesn't want anything to be separate from anything else. It's really something what's going on. And to him, when I say it's the shoe, I don't want it to say it's the shoe of the Malchus, because then it would just be the shoe of the Nuk, which might be a correct way of talking about things, but it's not only that. These shoes are really the shoes of the Nuk and the Za and Abiv Ima and Aricham ben Atik Yoimin. So he says like this, Kfaidat, you already know, and he actually said it a moment ago over here, and of course if you read that Chaim, you already know it, but again we're learning things here. So of course one of the big things that Rizal taught, that Rizal literally taught, that this is a difference between Olam HaShvira and Olam HaTikkun, and it's also a difference between the Rizal's way of reading Kabbalah and any other ways, so it's a good example of that, and I made a picture of it just so we could see it. And the Arizal's image is that we don't have Zel Malim, what the Arizal calls Zel Malim, so you should not imagine, you should not think of Olam atzilus, and of course this is not only a picture, but this is the diagram that we look at it. We don't only imagine the Atik being on top and Arich lower and Chacham a little lower and so on, but we imagine them as being Zalifnim is one inside the other, like a Russian doll, right? Or in earlier Kabbalah they didn't have Russian dolls; they said like an onion, right? And so if you look at a cross section of Olam atzilus, now there's differences at the top, which is what the Rizal teaches, that the reason why we say that Atik is higher than Arich is really because at the top of Atik there is no Arich. So if you would look, not in a cross section, you would look directly facing Atzilus, you would see on the top Arich and Atik and later Arich, and then Abavim and then Zun. So it's actually a beautiful way of understanding what's going on. That it says, yes, when you're looking at the Atzilus from the outside, what you would see is on the top Keser and then Chachma and so on. But I could look from the inside. I can give you a cross section of it. And if you know the actual cross section of it, you know that really Atik goes down until the bottom. And Arich also, and Abavim also, although Abavim is a little more complicated, but we're not getting into that. And Zon also. So in other words, that Rizal has this image of the Atzilus, like I showed you here, as they all finish in the same place. So the floor of Olam atzilus, so to speak, the feet of Olam atzilus, all of the feet are in the same place. So therefore, if you want to talk about a shoe for Olam atzilus, you really need to talk about, I'm not sure if it's really the image that we should imagine a little bit different, but it seems like you're thinking of something like this. So if you're thinking about the shoe of Olam atzilus, you would think of a shoe which is under Atik and Arich and Abavim and Zon, because their feet are all at the same place, and all of these, and then further down would be Olam bria. So this is the shoe that goes not only on the Zon, it actually goes at least because in the Zon is Atik, is Abavim, and in that is Arich and so on. So it's really going, and these feet are actually finishing all on the same level. So that's the Nal. In other words, when you put on your shoes, you're not only putting on the shoes of the Nuk, you're also putting on the shoes of Abavim and also of Atik and also of Arich. I'm going in the wrong order. But anyways, the shoes of every level of Matzilus, since your shoes need to cover. In other words, what we're talking about here, this is what he's really interested in. He's not interested in the Nalayim of the Nuk, he already talked about it earlier, but he's interested in the Nalayim of the Olam Matzilus. In other words, what makes the Olam Matzilus, what stops Olam Matzilus and creates that what's after that is Olam bria. So we have to talk about the entire Olam Matzilus. Of course, Olam Matzilus also has Atik and Arich and Aviv, Ima and Zon. So we have to talk about all of them and explain why this one shoe would be enough for all of them, because and this one shoe is under those feet, and this is what is the itself the masach that's mafsig between atzilus and bria. Okay. So that's one added distinction that there is added, that you shouldn't think of the shoe as being only on the malchus, it's really on all of the partzifim. But now we have to go in the other direction and understand that when we talk about a masach, we don't only talk about it as a mafsik, it's really also a mavit, right? It's not only a boundary, it's actually also a filter. But this filter is not only there to stop things, it's actually there, like I said earlier, to translate Olam atzilus into Olam bria. Right? So when you put on your shoes, we have to think of not only of stopping your body or your light, have from, like we said, being protected, and not only in the bad way. We talk this here over here. I'm not gonna make things complicated. Also talking about translating and giving over the light that you have into everything else. This is a very important, of course, going back to what the Ramak said, that we have to understand. This is going to talk about that when we talk about 10 spheres of Olam bria, we're really talking about a carbon copy. And they have a different language, but a carbon copy of the same of Olam atzilus. So it might be different matter, it might be a different Olam in some way, but it's also the same Olam in another way. In other words, it's also the same spheres, like the Ramak said. Otherwise, we would end up with too many spheres, and that's wrong. That's disallowed. Disallowed to have more than 10 spheres in Kabbalah. So the Ramak explained on this based on the Tikkun Ezar that the Olam Bria and by Bria Tzili is called the Choisam of Olam Atzilus. What he means by that is that imagine you have a stamp, right, and you have it has pieces that stick out, right? It's engraved in a way that you stick it into ink, and then they're not thinking of one in ink, they think of one in like clay or what do you call it? Like Play-Doh, no? Where you put the stamp into the clay, and then you end up with an image on the clay, and that image is not the stamp, right? It's something that was printed from the stamp, something that was an image of the stamp. And this is actually a very old image in philosophy. I'm not going to get into the stories of that. Very old image of describing how the same thing can go into another thing in some way. And the Mekabbalim at least use this image to explain the difference to Olam Atzilus. That Olam Atzilus is the actual stamp, or the actual piece of wood or piece of metal that you're using. So the real actual tense is Olam Bria is like when you put that and you stamp it into clay. That's the Olam Bria. And then we could talk about Olam Atzilus being a stamp of that, or different levels in the stamp. That's different. More differences that we can get to if we read Sharabiya, both in Yitzchok and in Pardes. The important thing for us is that now, according to this, we have to understand that when we talk about the masach, the thing that stops Olam Atzilus, right? It says Ad kan Olam Atzilus mekam ve'elach, right? Mekam ve'elach Olam Bria. That thing is also the translation layer, which creates this stamp, this instamping of Olam Atzilus in the Olam Bria. In other words, when you put on your shoes, you're not just stopping the light from going further, and therefore creating the boundary, the gvul of Olam Atzilus. I'm not just protecting from the klippas, which is somehow connected to this whole thing, but we're not going to get into how it's sort of connected, because it seems to be contradictory. But you're also actually instamping the Olam Bria from that, right? So in other words, if we want to talk about Derech Avoda, which is what we like to talk about, it's very important to not have boundaries that totally disconnect. There's actually no such boundary, apparently, in Kabbalah. In other words, every time, like we have this whole story, which I always think of, masach brachas, which there's a shomer in the Beis Medrash. They put a gate, they put a guard in front of his Medrash, Gamliel, put a guard, and said, whoever is not worthy of learning should not come in. Misha Antecha Kebaroi. And then Ibn Azari disagreed, and he took away the guard. In any case, it's still true that the Torah needs a guard. There needs to be some sort of boundary, which otherwise, like we said, otherwise it becomes klippas. Otherwise, you become, you start really, and this connects very much to what I was saying about the different worlds. Otherwise, you become part of America, and then it's very hard to even sustain what you're doing if it doesn't exist at all in that world. So in order for a greater world to exist, there needs to be some kind of gate that makes that world into another world. But whenever we do that, we never want to actually deny the outside from everything. What we really want to do, and this is what Arizal generally wants to do, is to deny the outside, to receive it in a way in which he would not be able to accept it. In other words, it would be worse, actually, if we just say the truth to anyone in the street. We would not be helping the street. It would be actually making him further away from the truth, because it's spoken in a language which he doesn't understand, and it's just turning him off. So what we always need to do is that this masach is actually also has the power, and since we're thinking of kavuna, I don't know what exactly the kavuna is, I sort of giving you the idea, to translate what happens in the atzilus into Olam Bria. So whenever you set up some gate, some kind of little group which says, this is going to be our circle, and we're going to protect ourselves, we're going to allow ourselves to do things that are more true to us inside this circle, you have to make sure that the wall that you set up around you has the capacity of also then translating it to others. It's not a really hermetic wall. It's not a totally closed wall. It's a wall that is actually what causes the translation to be able to happen. I think the real way this happens is with having different circles of people. We could call them students or call them partners, which each will take it and receive things. And if you see a good Rebbe somewhere, that's really what happens. Then they translate it further. So they serve both as a boundary, so you don't get burnt by the Rebbe's light, and they serve as a translation layer for the people that and therefore can get closer, and eventually maybe be that. But that's the like we learn Olam Bria, and eventually could become Olam atzilus. But that's again getting us into more complex territory. So this is what we're reading over here in as Gimel, like separated in the derech ze masach meir na partzifum da atzilus lemata bebria. Ki yotza oid derech ragli atik va derech ragli arich at shemagim ragli zon va marosim derech hamasach haniska. So through this masach, it's not only what stops Olam atzilus from bumping into Olam Bria, it's what gives over the light. And which light? Like we learned in the second thing, not only the light of the Nuk, but the light from Atik, which can through Adich, which can through Avim, which can through Zon, all of them through Olam Bria and Validezeh. And we learn as that. That's how in Olam Bria there's also 10 spheres. Nachtemu kol oiret atzilus, nachkok lemata bria kol es spheres the bria. Kedimion es spheres the atzilus. So therefore, that's how we could have in Olam atzilus. There's Atik the bria, there's Arich the bria. In other words, when you're the translator, when you're the Gabbai that stands that translates things for the people that don't understand, you're not going to want to translate only the last thing, like only the halacha lemasa. So therefore, you should go out and you're going to want to translate everything from the first level, from Keser, from the highest thing that the Rebbe taught. Of course, that itself will go through all the translation layers in order to make sense to someone in a different world. But you can't just translate the last thing. If you just translate the last thing, which what happens, like if you have the Torah itself, people say, okay, I'm going to teach someone entirely outside. Well, I'm just going to teach you to how to tie your shoes, right? Which we've been learning about. Halacha lamasa. You say, okay, halacha is the shechina, halacha is the malchus, halacha is the nuk, it's the halacha lamasa. That's all you need. But that's not true. Because in the nuk, there needs to be feeling, which is and in that there needs to be thought, which is bin, and in that there needs to be dvaikas, which is chachma, and in that there needs to be bittul, which is keser, or however you want to call it. In other words, really, if you teach some person that's starting from zero which way to tie your shoes, you really need to make sure to teach them also how the shoes are the zone, which are getting the protection of Imma and everything that we're learning here. Otherwise, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. And how exactly this works, again, something like I described. Now, the bria nekram chaysam shlas spheres atzilus converts line b'shar sham spheres. I've wrote where you should look if you want to look it up more clearly. These 10 spheres, the Olam bria, they're the chaysam, they're the stamp of. I don't know, stamp is the correct word. It's the part that gets stamped, right? That's what he means. Doesn't mean the stamp. He means the ink, or not the ink. Again, it's think of like clay. The clay that gets a insignia, like of the Olam bria atzilus. And then he says again, like mamash. So this is important. The oider raglaim literally derech hamasach. That's of course the closest level. So you get literally the light of the feet. So in other words, in some sense, we could talk about all the next elements as being the feet, like Chazal has language. Right? You should sit at the feet of the teachers, of the smart people. That's because you're going to get literally the light of the feet, but in their feet, so what I think what he's saying here when he talks about of course, in Yitzchok there's an elaboration of the differences between these things. What he means to say is that I just gave you the concept of a shoe, and shoe as the masach, shoe as the masach, which both receives from Atik up until there, and therefore gives it all over to the next level. Now, of course, this is a general concept. There's a masach between Olam atzilus and Olam bria. There's also a masach between Olam bria and Olam yitzira. There's also a masach between Olam yitzira and Olam asiyah. So therefore, maybe if you're in Olam bria, then your shoes will be the masach of Olam bria. Maybe if you're in Olam yitzira, in other words, just because you're in a different Olam doesn't mean that you don't have the same structure, doesn't mean you have the same patterns that we have. We talk. The Arizal generally likes talking about Olam atzilus, but the same thing is true for Olam bria. So maybe if you're wake up in a bad mood one day, and you don't want to be mechavan about how your shoes are the masach of Olam atzilus, you could be mechavan of the Olam bria or the Olam yitzira, and maybe even the Olam asiyah. Actually, it seems to have some sort of masach, and again, you could read over there to see exactly how. Okay, so this is Atkan is the basic understanding of this shoe. So if you're got up to here, then you should be happy, and you know the kavanah. Now, there's one more thing which really ties this back into the earlier discussion of chashmal being the chashmal of Imma. And there's one line over here, and actually, if you read Yitzchok, you'll understand exactly what he means. I'll try to just explain this line in simple terms, just so we could read it. So he says like this: "Vanillin is datis." This is Reb Chaim Vital speaking. Actually, in different places, he seems to say this in the name of Darizal. So it's a good question. What happened? So the Tikkun Zohar, which is really more or less the source of this whole idea of the four worlds, says a lot of things about them. Of course, he has this basic understanding, the basic ontology of them, which is that they're like chesumas, they're the engravings or the stamps of the upper worlds and all of the levels of that. And he also says something which divides the four worlds in the way of the four main spheres, or what Arizal would call the four main partzifim, right? Of course, Arizal has a fifth world, which is Ak, which would correspond to the fifth sphere, or Atik, or Ketz HaShaliyot. And the Tikkunim says, Abba, at least that's, we understand that there's some differences, again, in the details, but that's in the basic way. There is this four worlds. The four worlds are like the four oisios of the Shem Havaya. Abba would be, or Chachma, or the Yud would be the Olam Atzilus. Bina, or Imma, or the He of the Shem Havaya would be in the Olam Bria. So that's the language of the Tukkim is Imma Mekanna B'Kirsaya. The Imma, the Bina, has her home. Mekanna is like, again, we were thinking earlier of the bird, Kanesh Yarkina El Gazela Virachev. She has her nest. She nests in Olam HaBria. So if you want to translate, like Danny Matt likes translating the imagery, the Imma, this eternal mother, nests in the Olam HaBria. Right? That's how you translate Imela Makana B'Kirsaya. Well, actually, Kirsaya means in the throne, which is a Zohar code for Olam HaBria, because that's the Olam HaKisya covered. So if the Olam HaTzilis is the man, is the Odam HaLakisya, the Kisya is the Olam HaBria. Right? And then, moving on from that, the Teferes or the Zah is the Vav, is the Olam HaYetzira, and the Malchus or the Nuk, or the He'achrona of the Shem Havaya is in the Olam HaAsiyah. Now, the Arizal seems to have been very worried about what this actually means. Of course, the basic sense of it is just this, that we could always divide everything by this way. The Arizal is never really happy with that. Of course, it's true. We talk about the Shem Havaya, we could talk about it like we discuss. There should be a class like with these basics. Maybe I'll make one. We can discuss everything b'klal, b'prate, pratim, and so we can discuss in the most general klal as the four olamas, being the four oisis of the Shem. We can discuss this in one oilam, the 10 spheres. In each sphere we could divide again. So of course that's just an easy that everyone knows. The Arizal generally think that there's always depth beyond that. Although that's true, that's not enough for the Zohar to tell us these things, because like we know that already. So why does it have to tell it to us again? So in the Arizal, if you read that Chaim, there's different drishim. There seems to be four different readings that he has of this statement of the Tikkun Zohar, that Imma is in the bria and so on. And here the B'chai Tal is giving one of the reasons. And what he's really saying is something like this. What would it mean for the Olam HaBria to be the world of Imma? Yes, of course, it's true that if you look at the levels and you divide the levels and like Erech, and you can't, it turns out that that's useless. So what he really wants to get at is talk about going back to what really makes every Olam, like we said in the beginning, what really makes every Olam a different Olam? What really makes every Olam, or really every level in the world, a different level, is how pure, right? The level of purity, the level of openness of the light that it gets, right? Or how many mesachim and mavdilim it went through, right? So, of course, what makes Olam Atzilus is that it gets light through Chachma directly, and what makes Olam Bria is that it doesn't get the light directly, it only gets it through this nal, or this masach. Now recall that what we learned earlier, that this nal is really chashmal, and chashmal is really the outer shell, or the outer garment, or maybe the outer skin, questions of how exactly to read it, of the Imma Eloah, which encompasses the Zon in her, and that's what turns into the Nal. Therefore, we understand that, and this is the layer that separates Olam Atzilus from Olam HaBria. So now you understand that everything Olam HaBria gets, of course, Olam HaBria itself has Atik Arich. It's all translated in the way of Imma. So all the light that Olam HaBria gets is from this chashmal of Imma, and therefore we could talk about Imma Eloah Mekana B'Kirsaya. And therefore, in a similar way, he says that when we say that is the Olam HaYetzira, the Olam HaTeferes, it's because the masach that separates Olam HaBria from Olam HaYetzira is created not from the Imma Eloah, like the Olam HaTzilis, it's created from the Zah of Olam HaBria somehow. And the same way, when we say that Malchus is in Olam HaAsiyah, what we mean is that the Malchus of Bria is the translation layer that gives us everything, all the light in Olam HaBria. So that's why everything in Olam HaBria. So this is the B'chai Tal Tarizal's explanation of Imma Mekana B'Kirsaya, because going back to this Chashmal, which is the Chashmal of Imma, which is what is the Paraych, what is the Masach between Olam Atzilus and Olam HaBria, and therefore all the light Olam HaBria gets is through the language and through the Masach of Imma Eloah of Atzilus, right? Which goes through, which although it's really higher, but we learned earlier that it also covers up the zone of atzilus, and from there to el bria. So now we've finished all of the kavanas of wearing your shoes. Hopefully we'll have a different experience in putting on our shoes now that we have this class. Next time, what are we gonna do? What I'm planning to do, I'm sort of aiming. There's really, if you go on the Seder of Shara Kavanas, we sort of started in the beginning, and after this comes something called Inyan Abrachas, which talks about, it's known in the Shash world as Matpei Abracha, talks about the Kavanah